everyone, it's Stephanie here and welcome back to another video. Today we are going to be creating two cards using one die. This is the new All the Stars cover up die, and it features all of these great stars that will die cut from the center area, and it also cuts out the outside edge of the rectangle as well, so it makes it slightly smaller than an A2 size card, which measures 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. So what I want to do for my card design is I want to create an inked panel that we're going to die cut all of these stars from. So of course I'm going to do rainbow, but you can do these in any type of color. You could do just a specific color theme like blues and greens. You could do an ombre effect where you go really dark at the bottom and go lighter as you make your way up to the top. Or you can completely change it up and just use cardstock and die cut this directly from cardstock. Different colors, different pattern papers, anything that will make this a little bit quicker and easier than doing the ink blending. But I really like ink blending just because it blends really nicely together and you get that really seamless look with each color kind of blending into the next. So I did speed this up quite a bit, but you can see I'm just taking each of my distress ink colors and I started at one end and I'm just kind of swiping it across and then kind of going in a circular motion to really get that color blended. And I went back and forth between the colors to make sure I had a really nice blend and didn't have any harsh lines. And you can see now that when I put the cover plate on there, you can kind of see that we're going to get each of the different colors and all of the stars that are going to die cut. So I ran that through my die cutting machine. It did cut off a little bit of the edge there, as you can see, and then all of these little stars are going to easily pop out of here, and we're going to be able to create two cards using just this one die cut piece. So I'm just carefully popping out all of the stars, and I did switch over to tweezers because I found it a little bit easier to pop those out of there. And I am being careful to keep them all in the same order and the same orientation as when I took them out of that panel. This is just going to make it a lot easier when I start to add them back to my panel. So now that we have all of our pieces die cut, we can go ahead and start to assemble our card. So I have two white card bases, both measuring A2, which is 4 1/4 by 5.5. And the first card I'm going to create is the one with all of the loose stars. So I'm taking the large solid die cut piece and I'm adhering it to my card base, and I'm using repositionable tape so that I can easily remove this when I'm finished. I just want this to stay in place to use as a template so that we can add all of the small stars to our card base and make sure they're all lined up and exactly how they were originally when we die cut it. So I went through my stash and found the smallest little foam squares I could find, and I'm going to add one of these to each of the stars so that they have some dimension when we finish the card. Once again, I'm going to use tweezers to go ahead and add these back onto the card base, since I do find it a little bit easier to kind of turn them how they need to go rather than trying to do it with my fingers. I'm able to kind of see the stars a little bit easier doing it this way. So I'm just going to go one by one, and I'm going to add a foam square to the back of the star, and then I'm going to position it into the opening on the card base. Now this does take a little bit of time, I'm not going to lie, so if you don't want to take the time to do all of this, then I would recommend just doing them completely flat to the card and adding adhesive to the back of the stars and kind of adding them in one by one that way. That would go a lot quicker since you wouldn't have to worry about adding each individual foam square. And once I finished this, I also realized that it probably would have been a lot faster to apply the adhesive directly to the card base and then add the stars on top that way. I think that may have went a little bit quicker as well. But either way, I finished it and I love the final result, so I would definitely do it again. You can see as I'm kind of holding it up, you can see all of the dimension on those stars. I very carefully removed that repositionable tape, and now I'm just going to lift up on this outside piece since this is not adhered at all to the panel. And I'm just going to kind of push on the stars to pop them through the openings. And what we're going to be left with is all of those dimensional stars on the card base and the full panel, which can be used on the second card. Okay, so once I removed that outer piece, I realized that the stars were upside down with the pink on the top. So I flipped it over and the stars looked much better, obviously, since they were right side up, but I realized that I had glued them all onto my card base upside down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that white panel there, it's actually a card base right now, I'm going to trim it down into a panel and I'm going to adhere it onto a separate card base. Since I do want the stars to be upright, this is a very easy way to kind of fix that mistake, and I actually cut it a little bit smaller than the front of the card base so that I have a little bit of border of white on the card base and the panel's a little bit smaller. I just thought it would add a little bit more detail since we are leaving it very white on the outside edges. So that is mistake number one that happened while I was creating these. I did want to leave it in to show you what I did and how I fixed it. And you are going to see another one in a little bit here on that exact same card. So moving on to this one here, this is our full panel card. This one I decided I also wanted to have foam adhesive on. So once again, I did take the time to add a bunch of foam squares to this panel. If you wanted to go a lot quicker, I would just take some liquid glue and add it to the back of this panel very quick and easy and just add it right to your card base. But I really love the added dimension that it adds by adding these little foam dots. So I did go row by row and added these into the openings in between all of the stars. You can just go around the outside edge if you wanted. I really like to make sure that no parts of the card panel kind of sag into the card, so I would rather take the time and put a bunch of foam adhesive rather than not have enough. So I filled the whole entire panel, and then I'm going to just remove all of the little backing pieces. My craft room was definitely a mess after I finished this card. And then once I have that done, I'm going to go ahead and add this to the card base. I did make sure my card base was right side up this time, and then I added the panel to the front. And I love the little bit of shadow that you get in all of the openings of the stars by having that foam adhesive underneath the panel. You can see as I tilt them there the different dimension that we got. The foam squares I used on the individual stars were actually a little bit thicker, so they're more raised off of the panel, whereas the full panel I used thinner foam squares, so it's not as high up off the card. Okay, so now it's time for a sentiment on the first card here. So I'm using the little hello, and I've die cut it from black and white cardstock. I love the contrast of black and white with a very colorful card. I do it very often with a stamped sentiment onto a piece of black cardstock with white embossing powder. So I knew I would absolutely love die cutting the hello from white and adding it to a black shadow. So that's what's really cool about this die is you get both pieces when you die cut it. So you have the full word as well as the shadow in behind. I'm using some liquid glue to apply glue to the hello word. Then I'm just going to adhere it directly onto the shadow. And what we're going to end up with is the hello in the really bright white and then the black in behind, which is really going to help it stand out against all of that bright color and all of the white stars that are peeking through the die cut panel. I added some additional liquid glue onto the back of the shadow once we had it adhered, and I'm just going to add it directly to the card. Now you can kind of make it stand out a little bit more if you wanted to add a piece of vellum underneath of there. You could do like a little circle accent, but I really love the look of this directly on that panel, and I loved this card as is, so we are calling this one done, and we can move on to the second card and get that one finished. So for this card here, the first thing I need to do is add our panel to the card base. So I'm just going to take some liquid glue and add that to the back of the panel. I am finding that I'm using liquid glue a lot more to do a lot of the things I used to use my tape runner for. It's so much quicker and easier, and it really gives me that extra time to kind of get it into place. So I'm really loving this method of adhering stuff onto my card. Once I have it on there, I'm going to go ahead and create the sentiment. So I have the new Biddy Thanks and Gratitude stamp set. This is another great sentiment stamp set that coordinates perfectly with our Skinny Strips Die-namics. And you can see now that I'm very carefully removing the center row of stars on this card design. So what I did is I stamped out that Thanks Friends sentiment that you can see on screen there and put it on a smaller sentiment strip. And I could not find a place on the card that I liked how it looked. It just kind of covered the stars too much. It just didn't seem to fit with the overall design. So what I decided to do was remove that center area of stars very carefully, and now I'm stamping a second sentiment onto another piece of black cardstock, but this time I'm doing a much longer sentiment, and I'm going to die cut it with the longer Skinny Strips Die-namics. I initially cut this out with the Skinny Strip that has the fishtail banner ends, but it was a little bit too long for the card still, so I decided to trim off the ends and make them flat, and I finally got to a sentiment strip that I really liked on the card design. And since all of the stars do have dimensional adhesive on them, I decided to do the same with the sentiment strip so that everything was kind of at the same level. So I added a strip of that on the back of the sentiment strip. I used my T-square ruler, I got it lined up nice and straight, and then I adhered that on there. And now we have two different card designs, but they kind of have the same feel to them since they have the same colors with the rainbow, and they also have the same contrasting black and white sentiment, even though one is die cut and one is a stamped sentiment. And then we have that really great dimension by having that foam adhesive in behind the main panel as well as all of the individual stars. I hope today's video gave you some ideas on ways that you can use the new All the Stars cover-up Die-namics. As always, I appreciate you joining me for another video. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.